Naruto exclusive videos Lemon come out on my Boosty. You can watch and subscribe. Link in the description, like the video and write a comment, enjoy watching. Description: why do people travel? To see the world, meet new people, try other people's cuisines, or maybe to know themselves. A desert demon, burdened by a bad past, seeks the path and meaning of life, wanting to understand what was for him before empty words. What will reality be in the eye of the beholder? Prologue. The midday sun's rays mercilessly heated the sand that enveloped the village. A slight breeze swayed the hem of the girl's cloak as she carried a basket of fruit. She carefully selected each one, twirling the juicy fruits in her hands, assessing their suitability with a stern look. The greenhouse workers were probably watching the actions of this expert with interest, but she was only relying on her modest knowledge of botany. The strings of her soul were quietly plucked by Mrs. Excitement, tugging more and more often as she approached the cherished home. Sometimes the thought would pop into her head that her sullen younger brother would throw something angry at her for her handout. Adjusting her hood and hiding the light strands of her hair, she tried not to escalate the situation ahead of time. After the death of her mother, the girl remained the only woman in the family and often showed concern for her brothers. Although because of their warlike characters she was often ridiculed and bore the nickname Mommy. The streets gradually became less crowded. Many returned to their homes, although, living in the harsh desert conditions, they rather became their shelters. As she moved her feet along the stone-paved street, the girl felt the heat flowing down her ankles. Having reached the outermost border of her native Suna, she finally finished her journey. A modest one-story house appeared before her eyes, made of stone, like most of the buildings in their village. The girl knocked on the wooden door twice, but only modest silence responded. The girl knocked again, louder this time. "Gaara, it's Temari, please open up." The only response was an oppressive silence. She didn't like that the youngest of the brothers had decided to live separately, choosing this house on the outskirts. Of course, this place was chosen for a reason, the perfect place to escape outside the village in case of a fit of rage and bloodlust during the full moon. The young medium often suffered at the clutches of his tormentor, the one-tailed demon Shikaku, whispering increasingly terrible things day after day. After the planned attack on the Hidden Leaf village, Gaara changed a lot, but in a peaceful way. After the battle with Uzumaki Naruto, he decided for the first time to learn to control the demon of his own free will. This was his best decision in recent years, because the only person who could previously restrain the tailed beast's rampage was brutally killed. They all learned about the death of their father, their great fourth leader of the Hidden Sand village, only when they returned to their homeland. Temari and the middle brother looked at each other warily, realizing that if their youngest goes crazy, then all that would remain of the village would be its name and a mountain of corpses of shinobi and civilians. The thought of this sent a chill down the spines of the relatives, and their hands trembled, unable to contain their excitement. Temari decided to open the door, having found the keys to her younger brother's apartment in her belt bag. Upon entering, she expected to stumble upon a trap or a blow from a sand fist, but the silent atmosphere frightened her even more. Leaving the basket of fruit in the small hallway, she walked around the entire house. No one was there. The girl was running around checking the training grounds, sectors, and even the Shinobi Academy, but not a single living soul had seen her sullen little brother. Her heart sank at the sudden disappearance of Gaara. He had just returned from the southern borders, quite exhausted, even for his stoic body and spirit. The last time Gaara looked so battered was during the attack on Konoha. The girl's face was distorted with indignation, and her eyebrows were drawn together. Everyone who was unfortunate enough to catch the Sand Princess's eye felt how her piercing gaze made their blood run cold. No one had the patience to look her in the eyes when she was in such a mood. Having reached the middle brother's house, Temari was already nervously fiddling with her fingers, as if that could calm her down a little. "And if I'm not alone?" the guy grumbles discontentedly, rubbing his sleepy face with his wide palms. After such an unexpected visit, he didn't even expect to hear a simple wish. "Good morning, Kankuro. I can't find Gaara anywhere. I asked everyone, no one has seen him since yesterday evening." "Temari, slow down. Taking a deep breath, Kankuro continued, "You know our brother very well. He could go on a mission or to the training ground to train, or hang out in his favorite caves if he's not in the mood." Temari immediately got the hint. "And he rarely reports his movements to us." Looking at the blonde's serious face, Kankuro realized that he had failed to calm her rebellious heart. "I've already checked everywhere," the girl stated, pursing her lips. "It's as if he's disappeared. That's also possible," the young man answered sarcastically, moving deeper into the house. "What?" Temari didn't appreciate the joke. "Okay, give me 5 minutes. We'll find him." The search was no more fun with two of them. Rather, the older sister's nervousness tried to spread to Kankuro, but his cold mind did not give in to such provocations. It probably helped that he got a good night's sleep and came back to normal after the long B-rank missions. Having peered into another sandy cave ridge, the brother and sister looked around warily, afraid to confirm their suspicions due to exhaustion. Their younger brother could lose control over his bloodthirsty demon. Temari's face lit up with lightness and a bit of happiness when she saw Gaara's figure from behind. She let out a sigh of relief, slowing her pace. "You see, and you were worried." Kankuro stopped short, seeing his younger brother's cracked face. Piece by piece, the visible image began to disintegrate until it turned into a pile of sand. Shadow clone. Then, as if by an invisible whirlwind, the particles danced in the air, but immediately collapsed, forming first into letters, then words. "He left us a letter?" the elder sister remarked. "Temari, Kankuro. I have decided to go on a mission to deliver a scroll to the Lord of the Land of Snow. And of course, I guess you won't approve of my enthusiasm for solo missions, but there are several reasons for that. All this time, I was considered a weapon to be feared. And this has instilled fear in the hidden sand itself. If this were not the case, my father would not have tried to kill me 6 times. It bothers me that there are people who are against me in my quest to become Kazekage. I want to heal all the pain I caused, but it is very difficult to make people from the sand believe in my sincerity. I admit, sometimes I think that the pain I caused will never go away. Maybe this is my attempt to disappear from the hidden sand, and maybe then the fear will disappear along with me? Who knows? I want to look once again into the eyes of the demon that sits inside me and understand for myself several complex and at the same time simple truths. Please do not persecute me. My sincere desire to find the answer to my question lies in independent knowledge of the world and myself. For a very long time I have been tormented by the question, should I continue to stand my ground or change my mind? This is a dilemma for me. Gaara. Well, at least he didn't become a missing nin, Kankuro noted briefly. Chapter 1. It was getting dark. A dry branch cracked under his foot, but Gaara wasn't distracted by this trifle. Should I continue to stand my ground or change my mind? Every minute of his journey was filled with this thought. And a whole bunch of others. He had personally experienced how other people's dreams have an interesting effect they inspire. No matter how crazy and impossible it may seem, you only have to see the glowing eyes and enjoy the sincere speeches once, and you involuntarily begin to imagine yourself in the place of the dreamer. It was amazing to him how these fleeting images sharpened all his senses, depriving him of peace. It seemed that the dream of his friend from the Hidden Leaf Village was like a cloud floating in the sky, moving across the firmament, getting closer and closer, and he only had to stretch out his fingertips to touch it. But then he felt an unpleasant burning sensation under his fingers, and a malicious voice in his head repeated, "You can't do that. Never!" And I wanted to rip off the skin, penetrate the blood vessels, merge with the life-giving liquid, to quickly reach the cherished subcortex of the brain and shout back, "I can do anything! I'm the same as him!" Only his own voice is quiet, barely rustling in his consciousness, because he is constantly screeching. A shrill, goosebump-inducing voice of a demon, tirelessly reminding of his existence. He looms in the cage of the inner world, languishing from inconsolable attempts to throw off the shackles and take over his mind. The demon still believes in his victory. Fighting is hard, and it's only through fighting that you realize you're worth something. Show me what you're worth. his father once told him. Only when he grew up did Gaara understand why he was constantly told these words to make sure his true identity hadn't sunk into oblivion. Gaara has caught himself thinking so many times that it would be much easier to give control over his body to this tailed misunderstanding, not to think about the consequences, in order to finally hear the cherished silence. But he already knows that it will be short. Gaara stops, leaning his back against the nearest tree. He presses his open palm to his face again, feeling another scream of a bloodthirsty demon ringing in his ears, asking for a victim. This time, anyone, even those without much strength, is allowed. Anyone! Let's! The tailed one burns inside, rushes about in the cage erected by the mind, beats with its large paws on the bars of willpower. As it turns out, Gaara has a strong will. Even more than he expected. When that meeting happened, he felt like he had awakened from a real dream, which he had not known about since the time he could remember. And now he had received the most important thing: power over himself. Over his mind and over his body. Gaara repeats again. No, he orders the demon to be silent. Deep breath. More. A gust of wind lifted a few leaves into the air and swirled them above his head. Deep breath. More. And there is silence. The kind that has never before fluttered like a calm in his head, clearing his mind. The kind that was more soothing than herbal infusions and meditation. The kind he had longed for but had never achieved in the last few years. Having regained his mind, inflamed by the demonic scream, Gaara realized that he could do anything. Absolutely anything. The light of the full moon felt like the sun's rays. Removing his open palm from his face, revealing the love symbol on his forehead, was not as scary as it used to be. Gaara knew that if he opened his eyes, he would see a path with a few bushes and a tall tree, not the remains of human bodies. Gaara glanced around, remembering the mountain range he had spotted on the map, a third of the way there already. Starting to move toward the nearest town again, he lightly patted his travel bag, his brows furrowing sadly. His legs dragged him forward, and the moon slowly moved far behind him. He stopped only briefly when a modest-sized village appeared on the horizon. From the heights, 2 or 3 dozen houses and only one street could be counted. Casting a simple concentration seal, he transformed into the boy he had met the day before. They were of similar build, except that he didn't have the bright, flame-like hair, just ordinary black strands that barely touched the tips of his ears. Gaara now looked at the world with the same brown eyes, just like the craftsman who had offered to buy him the clay bowl. He continued on his way. The dawn woke up the locals with warm, pleasant rays of the sun. Some were leisurely going out onto the porch of their houses, while others were already opening tents with vegetables and fruits. Gaara was approaching the main gate of this settlement. He looked around, not noticing the post with the shinobi on duty, and walked on. The only wide street blossomed with every step, filling with people and everyday decorations. Carefully putting food into his bag, Gaara wondered how far away those who had started following him almost immediately after he left the village were now. His sensor skills were almost always good, and he could not feel the chakra that was coming from his pursuers. But trusting only one feeling when the number of assassination attempts had exceeded 20 was stupid. He had to leave this village as soon as possible, and use his secret technique, the hidden sand cat drawing. Gaara had managed to master it while serving on the southern border, and no one knew about it except his small squad. Although even his comrades then could not understand what they had seen and how it had happened. "Oh, excuse me, sir." The young girl behind the counter dropped a few apples, staring at the customer. Gaara was familiar with this maneuver. His brother had a dozen admirers who would coquettishly and awkwardly drop things in front of him, and he would hand them back to their owners with a triumphant grin. It would end with mutual glances or a late-night stroll. And so the girl in front of him began to make eyes at his transformation. Gaara watched silently and did not react as she wanted. The damage to the goods did not interest her much. The silence dragged on, becoming unnecessarily oppressive. Gaara twitched his index finger, causing the sand to gather around the fallen fruits, and in a moment they were near his hand. He carefully placed them on the edge of the shelf and looked expectantly at the girl. I'll replace everything now, she stammered, timidly lowering her eyes and embarrassed. Having left the village and made sure that there was no surveillance, Gaara wandered into the forest thicket. Sand crumbs immediately appeared around him. Dispelling the transformation technique, he took on his usual appearance. Gaara rarely used this jutsu, but its special origin, or rather, its purpose to be the main weapon of the Sand Village, which enemies would not mind getting, obliged him to remember the basics of shinobi. As he wandered among the trunks of the great trees, he felt his chakra consumption drop significantly. This could only mean one thing: the shadow clone he had left in the cave had dissipated, and Temari and Kankuro had received the message. Gaara was already anticipating how his older brother would restrain his agitated sister, the main savior of his destitute younger brother. Well, it was still worth noting that he had made a wise decision to warn his brother about his intentions to go on a mission alone. Previously, Gaara had caused Kankuro only fear and disgust. The older brother did not even hide it, making a dissatisfied face and throwing barbs when talking to his sister. Temari, of course, never allowed herself such impudence. Gaara had a hard time reconciling with his loved ones. Living under the yoke of his tyranny for several years could not easily disappear from his memories, as soon as Gaara said, "Forgive me. But people change, and this is the best thing that can happen to them. You don't need to stop me. You do understand that." Temari grabbed her brother's hands, trying to fight off his strong grip. "Stop treating him like a helpless kitten," Kankuro spoke calmly. "Our brother has long since grown up, and you know how strong he is. Temari, our village needs us while Gaara does his duty. This mission is very important. Even if something happens, believe me, he can stand up for himself." And Temari knew and saw with her own eyes what usually happened to Gaara's enemies. But every time she looked at her younger brother, she saw that little boy from her childhood, with whom she played in the sandbox. Temari remembered his childishly innocent eyes and sweet smile. He was about 3 years old then. She helped build sand castles, which later became houses and a small village, so similar to their native Suna. The younger brother did not look like that evil substance that his father and his confidants called him behind closed doors. Temari sincerely did not understand for what actions people protected him with the vile word monster. Gaara smiled, seeing the finished town. And Temari smiled, seeing the happy children's eyes, until she shuddered, hearing a voice behind her back. "Temari, go home. Quickly!" A tone that did not require delay. The girl looked at her younger brother for the last time and was drowning in the disappointment that was overtaking the boy. The smile had disappeared without a trace from his face. Yashimaru immediately ran up to Gaara, trying to cheer him up, but he continued to look at the retreating silhouette of his older sister. Constantly turning around, Temari felt an incredible heaviness in her chest. From now on, the father forbade his eldest daughter to visit Gaara, frightening the girl with cruel stories that were beyond her years. Temari did not believe, or rather, did not want to believe what she heard. She tried to think about her own things, just so as not to imagine these stories that sent a chill down her spine. And then came that fateful test that crossed out everything good about that little boy with the eyes of a cute kitten. Temari began to have nightmares. They were woven from stories from her father and the victims of this sand tomb she had seen. Growing up and shaking with fear at the sight of Gaara, she wondered every time what would have happened if she had had the courage to disobey her father? Could it have prevented the disaster that befell their family? She didn't know the answer to that question and blamed herself for the missed opportunity. Now that guilt had turned into overprotectiveness, nagging instructions and advice, she wanted so badly to protect this sweet boy from the sandbox whom she had abandoned. But could she? "Kankuro, I just don't want to lose Gaara," Temari said in a half-whisper. "The Gaara who now considers us his family. You know what I mean, right?" "I understand, sister. I understand." Gaara was pulled from his contemplation of the night sky by the sound of an explosion nearby. The sand from the gourd stirred cautiously, reminding him that if his master made a wish, he would immediately deal with the source of the sound. Gaara listened. Following the explosion, steel began to ring restlessly and cautiously, and the wind sliding along the treetops carried the smell of burning for several kilometers. A battle was going on. Close. The contents of the gourd stirred again, and countless grains of sand formed in front of his face. Extending his arm and pulling them towards his open palm, Gaara channeled chakra into the sand. The grains swirled, forming a sphere, and later an eye materialized. He placed his index and middle fingers over his right eye and established a connection with his technique. Pointing his best reconnaissance tool into the battle, Gaara watched the action with a keen eye, 1 kunoichi against 6 shinobi. A thick cloud of smoke still hung in the air, providing an excellent opportunity for sneak attacks. The explosion managed to briefly disorient the opponents, but it did not improve the situation much. The girl lay motionless on the ground. A tall and thin boy made wind seals and dispersed the curtain with a powerful vortex. The kunoichi's opponents cheered up. Another shinobi took out several kunai and immediately threw sharp blades towards the helpless enemy, but they never reached their target. A huge owl appeared before them, spreading its wings and blowing away the enemies. The bird was several times larger than its owner, and its beak was gleaming white. It was surrounded by a steel guard covered in sharp spikes. The kunoichi stirred, rising up on her elbows. The owl watched her mistress's actions carefully and then flew off into the distance. A few seconds later, the bird swooped down, and once again the darkness of the night was illuminated by the glow of the explosion. Gaara decided to intervene. He cast a simple concentration seal using the body flicker technique and appeared next to the kunoichi who was about to accept defeat. The sand filled with chakra didn't let anyone take a single step. The men cursed loudly and looked at each other in bewilderment. Someone even started to hit the sand paws that held their ankles with kunai. However, it was all useless. "Are you hurt?" The kunoichi winced, not expecting to hear someone so close. She moved vigorously, trying to crawl away. "Don't be afraid, I want to help." The girl looked at her opponents, convinced of the words of the suddenly appeared ally. "My lady. They kidnapped her, can you walk? Help her, please." She pointed with a trembling hand. "My owl is there now." Gaara continued to hold off the shinobi, but now they decided to direct their attacks at him. Gaara was surrounded by a continuous sand shield, his absolute defense. To protect the kunoichi from their attacks, Gaara decided to immobilize his opponents. Raising his hands above his head, he diluted the density of the ground around the shinobi's feet. The men quickly began to sink into the depths of the earth, as if drowning in quicksand. Binding sand coffin! The shinobi began to scream, trying to grab onto the branches of the trees torn apart by the explosions. After making sure that they could no longer attack, Gaara headed in the direction indicated. The summoning animal guarded the wrecked carriage and the people who were trying to recover from the explosive scroll. The owl hooted quietly, patrolling the area. Seeing the approaching man, the bird fluttered and immediately appeared in front of Gaara's face. The owl angrily accelerated the flapping of its mighty wings, clearly trying to drive up the wind stronger so that it could repeat the trick on the kunoichi's enemies in the forest clearing. "I won't hurt you." Gaara raised his open palms and looked straight into the bird's bright yellow eyes. "Let me help you." The fight was short. Seeing a new enemy who had his eye on the prey, the mercenaries bared their teeth and exposed their shurikens. The iron glittered in the moonlight, dreaming of cutting the air with its sharp edges. But nothing and no one could overcome the absolute defense of the pride of the hidden sand village. Repeating his famous technique, Gaara approached the carriage. The owl hooted softly behind him and vanished. The summoning was over. Either time had run out, or the owner's chakra had run out. The latter was a less preferable option. The grains of sand from the gourd swirled, turning into a hand, and it carefully opened the door. Inside lay a girl, bound hand and foot. Shaking her head and thus throwing the dark strands of hair from her face, the prisoner made out the one who had entered. "Let me go, please. I will pay you, just name the amount." Gaara approached, directing the sand towards the girl. She flinched in fear, tears appearing in her eyes. "Oh, Kami, why are you silent? Do you think I—" The sand particles coalesced into thin streams that began to untie the ropes on the captive's hands and feet. "I don't think anything." Gaara answered shortly. I'm not one of your kidnappers. Huh! The girl straightened her numb arms and almost squealed. I met a wounded kunoichi in the forest. She asked me to rescue you. That's how it is, good. Feeling that the danger had completely receded, she smiled slightly, but only for a moment. Take me to her, please! She tried to stand up, but her legs failed her. Having taken a step, the girl almost immediately collapsed onto the wooden floors of the carriage. Seeing these pitiful attempts, Gaara decided to help her, catching her with his sand. Using the body flicker technique again, he transferred her to the injured kunoichi, who had managed to lose consciousness and did not respond to the worried voice of the kidnapped one. The girl touched the kunoichi's neck with trembling hands, and then leaned towards her face to check her breathing. She's exhausted, but she'll live, Gaara assured quite confidently, trying to calm the freed captive. Excuse me, Shinobi-san, do you have anything to bandage the wounds with? The prisoner managed to examine the kunoichi. My escort has an injured arm, it needs to be bandaged. With absolute protection, Gaara rarely bothered to carry a first aid kit on missions, so he shook his head. The girl let out a frustrated sigh and reached into the wounded kunoichi's belt pouch, pulling out the last kunai. Bringing the steel to the hem of her long dress, she tore off a piece of cloth and began bandaging the girl's wound. She was doing a poor job. The piece of cloth did not tighten the wound tightly enough to stop the bleeding. Gaara heard loud sobs. Why? The captive scolded herself, whispering menacingly. Why? Her hands were not obeying her, and the bandage kept falling apart. She continued to squeeze the blood-soaked cloth, swallowing bitter tears. Gaara sadly watched her futile attempts and decided to intervene. Let me! Seeing someone's despair was beyond his strength. He was never looked at like that. Gaara was usually on the other side of the coin, a monster attacking people. When Yashimaru managed to save a poor guy who looked askance at the young medium, he was looked at like that, a savior. Gaara pulled off all the cloth the girl had managed to wrap around her injured arm and started over. He had learned the basics of first aid while serving on the southern borders. The demon in his head taunted him. When did this most formidable weapon of the sand start to value life so much and save others? After finishing the bandage and resting the wounded woman, Gaara looked at his former captive, who was shivering from the night cold like a leaf in the wind. Her legs were noticeably exposed, and she was now sitting on a small rock, hugging her knees tightly. Tell me, is she definitely okay? I'm not a doctor, I don't know for sure, but the wound is not dangerous. Thank you. A bitter tear flowed down her cheek again. We'd better move to a less windy place. There's a stone gorge nearby, we can stay there for the night. Okay. Approaching the kunoichi again, the girl tried to lift her up, placing her on her back, but Gaara stopped this attempt, catching the wounded woman's body with his sand. Can you walk by yourself? The freed captive nodded briefly, the desperation in her eyes, reflected in the moonlight, begging for it all to end soon. They walked in silence, occasionally distracted by the kunoichi's drawn-out moans. The treasured stone gorge was indeed nearby. Sharp gusts of wind did not penetrate inside, swirling and howling from the forest. It was too dark, so only silhouettes and rare movements could be discerned. Gaara was positioned at the entrance. A few meters away from him were the kunoichi and the previously kidnapped girl. The captive lay down next to the wounded one, pressing herself against the uninjured shoulder, as if trying to keep the one who had not regained consciousness from freezing. For Gaara, such behavior was strange. The kidnapped one called the kunoichi escort. But her attitude towards her spoke of much deeper feelings, usually the way one cares for loved ones or close people. For now, he decided to watch them, although he wanted to ask about everything. A few hours later, a voice was heard in the cave. The one that had previously asked for help for its mistress. Ajasai! Exclaimed the mistress, causing the other to shudder. How glad I am that you are alive! Ruri-san. I was afraid that you would never wake up. The girl babbled, barely holding back her tears. Who is this? The escort froze, pointing behind the mistress. This is the shinobi-san who helped us. Sorry, I don't remember almost anything. The girl instinctively grabbed her head. It's okay. Gaara intervened in the conversation. Those who attacked you have left these places. I will leave you soon, too. No, please, Shinobi-san. Ruri jumped up and approached Gaara. Stay with us, just for a little while. Ajisai has just come to her senses, and I haven't. Okay. He nodded briefly. Thank you very much. The wounded woman spoke up. Ruri-san and I are in your debt. Yes, thank you. She immediately bowed, folding her arms across her chest. Oh, I forgot to ask your name. Excuse me, Shinobi-san, what is your name? Gaara. And you? I am Ruri, and this. He pointed his palm at the wounded woman. Is Ajisai. Of course, he had already understood everything from the conversation, but formalities were necessary for civilians like Ruri. He immediately felt that she was not a kunoichi. Her chakra was not surging through her body like all the shinobi he had encountered before. She did not know the basic rules of conduct on a mission, allowing herself the stupidity of not expecting an attack from behind, and was an absolute zero in providing first aid. But the second. Why did they kidnap you? Gaara waited for the moment when the girls exchanged a few words. We don't know, most likely because of our last performance. Seeing the puzzled look of her savior, Ruri immediately clarified. I'm a traveling musician. I play several instruments and sing. Many people like it, and I'm invited to perform at various festivals. In the last village they gave me a lot of money, perhaps these people knew and… Ajisai raised herself up with Ruri's help and formed a seal of the element of fire. The sand rustled unfriendly in the air. Gaara tensed, expecting an attack, but the girl directed a thin stream of fire at a pile of small stones, heating them red-hot. The fire blew a cherished warmth. The air in the cave became damp. Ruri-san, move over there, Ajisai asked, pointing to a place behind the hot stones. It will be warmer there, you are frozen. You need to warm up too, let me help. A thin stream of sand began to fall onto the rocks, filling the cave with fine pollen. The girls headed towards the hot rocks together. We don't bite. Looking at the swirls of sand that swirled around the neck of the bottle gourd, Ajisai exhaled nervously. Come on over, warm up! Gaara was in no hurry to approach them, deciding not to leave the ideal place to retreat. Fighting in such an unstable rock ravine was obviously a bad strategy. Then why didn't they just rob you? Gaara began again, returning to the conversation. Your things weren't touched. I noticed them a couple of kilometers from the battle site. We don't know, maybe they kidnapped me with other intentions. Ruri forced a smile, realizing the illogicality of the first version. So you're the escort? Gaara turned his gaze to Ajisai. Yes. Her answers were short. Then where are your partners? I don't have any. Ajisai cleared her throat. I'm alone on a mission. What village are you from? I'm from Suna. Gaara's emotionless face was struck with surprise for the first time in a long time, causing him to raise his eyebrows sharply upon hearing the name of his home village. I see. Show me your protector. Ajisai reached for her belt pouch with her healthy hand, but Gaara already knew it was empty. Why? All shinobi from hidden villages wear protectors, is it that hard? The girls exchanged glances. Who are you? Without waiting for their answer, Gaara demanded an answer in a commanding tone. So you're hunting for the mistress too? Ajisai said, trying to assume a fighting stance. Hunting? Gaara repeated. If I hadn't seen the explosion, our meeting would never have happened. Why should we believe you? Ajisai. Ruri perked up, tugging at her sleeve with trembling fingertips. No need. Usually they attack me. When I saw the explosion, I thought that they had sent some incompetents after my head who had blown themselves up in their own trap, and I went there to neutralize them. Are you being hunted too? Ruri looked sadly at her savior. I repeat the question, who are you? I come from independent lands, we both fled from our village. Believe me, Gaara, we are not enemies. There is no point in shedding blood senselessly. Ruri immediately began to answer. Ajasai will not be able to fight in this state. I do not know how to do anything at all. And you seem more reasonable to me than everyone we have met before. Let's talk. The lady looked reproachfully at her escort, and she sank limply onto the stones. I fled my native land when a revolution was organized there. The ruling family was overthrown, tyranny and repression began. Local residents are forced to work in the extraction of natural metals and to manufacture weapons, but there are no conditions for this. People are constantly getting sick and dying. Any deserters are considered traitors and conspirators to overthrow the revolutionaries, so they are persecuted. I have no evil intentions, I just want to live an ordinary life. Are you from a noble clan? No. Then why does she? Gaara continued, pointing his finger at Ajasai. Call you mistress? The girls perked up. Ruri bit her lip, as if trying to remember if they could have let it slip. I once saved her life, it's a formality. How did this happen? Huh? Ruri responded, as if she didn't understand what they were talking about. How did you save her life? She fell silent. Ajasai clenched her fist with her good hand, unable to bear such questions. She was like a blazing fire, ready to burn. The beginning was good. You thought I wouldn't feel that you were lying? You. Ajasai was struck by the only correct guess. A sensor? Thanks to the sand, I can not only sense chakra, but also any energy fluctuations of the people around me. Gaara tilted his head slightly to the side and continued asking leading questions. Ruri-san, answer the last question. What is the Kurigaya clan patch doing on your clothes? Chapter 2. Ruri reached into the sleeve of her hanfu, and a click was heard. Gaara was wary, but did not give free rein to the sand. In the girl's hands was an ornament, slightly smaller than half the size of a palm. The cut of the precious stones immediately caught the barely reaching moonlight. See this brooch? It's too beautiful to hide. Starting to twirl the decoration in her slender fingers, Ruri continued. A family heirloom of the Kurigaya clan, passed down from mother to daughter. This trinket can grant me a serene, calm life, or it can kill me. You are the heir to the ruling family of the independent village of Kiriwa, right? Hearing the name of her native place, the girl shuddered. And you know a lot of things. Yes, I am the heiress who left her people. Ajasai touched her mistress's shoulder with her healthy hand as a sign of consolation. My father once told me the story of our village. My ancestors settled in these lands, planting a huge number of polones, and the wasteland eventually became the largest grove of this valuable tree. Travelers often stopped for a rest, later telling others about this wonderful place at the junction of the arid desert, and not reaching the steep cliffs, where masters of wood carving, making musical instruments and household items lived. Mrs. Kurigaya hissed sharply, accidentally pricking her finger with a needle from a brooch, but continued the story. Our village never participated in political intrigues with other villages and independent lands. My ancestors preserved this place as a stronghold of humanity from wars, suffering, pain. Why was your family overthrown? I don't know. Ruri folded her hands in her lap, playing with the brooch again. It's too early for me to learn how to govern a village, so if my father encountered any difficulties, I don't know what kind. But I know who the leader of the conspiracy was, the head of the personal guard of the heir to the throne. Did you see how it all happened? Young Kurigaya was embarrassed by the question, and tears began to well up in her eyes. Gaara immediately realized that he had gone too far, but what was said could not be undone. Sorry. As a shinobi, it's easier for me to talk about death. I led the lady out of the chambers as soon as it all began. Ajasai answered for her. I am her personal bodyguard. I see, Gaara said thoughtfully. But maybe your relatives are still alive? No, that's out of the question. Ajasai intervened again. I can't talk about it in front of Ruri-san, if you know what I mean. How many times have you been attacked already? Today was the third attempt. Most likely, these were hired Nuknin, because I have never seen the protectors of the hidden villages. The escort continued. Also, none of the attackers were listed among the personal squad. I remember faces well. Ruri fell asleep near the newly warmed stones. Ajisai settled closer to the exit, where she began to create more pleasant conditions in the temporary shelter. Gaara felt the cold of the night take hold of his fingers without a twinge of conscience, causing them to shoot at the joints whenever he moved too much. His feet also tingled unpleasantly from every breath of wind he caught. Ajisai used the fire technique again, this time for longer. As soon as the pile of stones became extremely hot, she took off her worn-out shoes and stretched her legs closer to the heat source. The tense face immediately smoothed out in bliss. Watching the girl's actions, Gaara couldn't help but wonder how useful the elements could be for the harsh, everyday life of a shinobi. Opening one eye, Ajisai grinned contentedly as she saw the palms of the only male shinobi in their company hidden under his clothes. Maybe at least now you will allow me to thank you for your help. My teeth are not chattering yet, but I see that this night is cold even for you. Gaara nodded, not wanting to argue. The trust issue had been resolved after the conversation a couple of hours ago, so there was no reason to refuse. Sitting down next to him, but still keeping a comfortable distance, Gaara was even a little glad to see him for the first time. The nights were getting colder and colder with each passing day. Just like in his native desert. The bodyguard did not close her eyes, only occasionally rubbing her fingers on her wounded hand. Ajisai, the kidnappers weren't strong shinobi. Gaara began quietly, trying not to wake Ruri. I suppose you can guess that yourself. They took over with numbers. I'm not the best escort for the mistress, so call it what it is. The girl sighed in disappointment. I'm trying to train to protect Ruri-san, but I must admit, I don't really know the basics. Didn't you study at a ninja academy? Ajisai picked up a small stone near her foot, twirling it in her good hand. She and her mistress had similar habits. No, I didn't have the chance. I was a baby when my parents died on a mission, and I was sent to an orphanage. Then, from what I still remember, already in the orphanage, when I was 10 years old, people came there, gave us some papers and watched what would happen. For some it burned, for others it got wet or rotted. An elemental determination test, Gaara guessed. Probably, the girl was not familiar with the subtleties of terminology. Mine burned. Everyone who had, as you say, an element determined, was taken with them. Then there was a long journey. We were dragged from one place to another. Then we settled somewhere on the seashore. Then for the first time I saw something other than shabby walls and a couple of bushes. They began to train us. For several months, grown men taught snotty children to throw shurikens, the basics of hand-to-hand combat and elemental ninjutsu. Pathetic attempts. I don't remember much of what happened, but then they put us on some huge ship, and we found ourselves on an island. Having thrown away the pebble, Ajisai turned her gaze to the peacefully sleeping Ruri. There they forced us to fight each other, and the winners were sent to fight in the Colosseum. The Colosseum? This was the first time Gaara had heard of such a place. This is a place where rich people would put their shinobi on display and place bets on them fighting. The losing shinobi would go to the winning shinobi. I didn't think such a thing existed. I won the internal battle, but lost in the Colosseum. The rich man, to whom I belonged, did not see in me the potential for his personal guard and wanted to kill me, but at that moment the lady, or rather her father, intervened. Ajisai began to warm up her fingers again. The bleeding has most likely stopped, Gaara suggested, noticing the frequent manipulations with the injured hand. We can't leave the bandage tight for too long. Let me loosen it. Yes, I won't mind. He moved closer, unwinding the cloth from the securely bandaged wound. She and her father went to pick up the new shinobi who fought after my fight. If Ruri-san hadn't intervened then, I would have just ended up God knows where. So, she bought you. Her father, Ajisai corrected him. And I've been serving her ever since. I was so happy to be under my mistress's care. She always treated me very well. At first she called me her big sister. I was treated by the best medic in their village, and later I was taught literacy and etiquette. To be honest, I really let myself go as a kunoichi, relaxing from life in their estate, for which I now blame myself. When the coup began, I couldn't help the family that had sheltered me. My skills were only enough to help Ruri-san escape and not see the horror that happened. Tell me, Why are you sure that no one except Ruri could survive? Maybe they are being held in a dungeon, for example? Ajisai quietly sat up, making sure that her mistress was still asleep. Lowering her voice to a barely audible level, she leaned towards Gaara's face. I created a shadow clone and sent it to the estate. There was no one there anymore. People were screaming in the center of the village, and my clone heard the scream of the mistress's mother among them. The invaders took the family to the main square and tied them to a pole like some kind of cattle. The residents tried to help them, but the personal guard squad dealt cruelly with the especially brave ones. And then they started throwing bales of hay onto the tied people. Ajisai's breathing became heavier with each word. They set them on fire. The head of the invaders started shouting that anyone who tried their luck helping the Kirigaya family would be blown to dust along with them. The locals, who had never seen such atrocities, ran home in fear. And I dispersed the equipment and, grabbing the mistress by the arm, ran as fast as I could. The sand that Gaara had spread throughout the cave did not move even once. Looking at the sleeping heiress of the Kurigaya clan, the boy could not help but imagine what it must have been like for the remaining relatives of his victims, who had died as painfully as this girl's family. I didn't tell the lady how exactly her family died. I couldn't. Ajisai once again formed the seal of the element of fire, directing a stream of fire at the cooled stones. The tongues of flame trembled, almost not obeying. I still dream of their screams. Before dawn, fatigue took over and Ajisai fell asleep, leaning against the rocky wall. Gaara continued to look at the stones, which gradually changed their scarlet, sometimes crimson color to the usual, almost featureless gray. The revelations of his temporary fellow travelers made him think hard about the mood of the residents and the political elite of his native village. So far, only his brother and sister and the council of elders knew about his desire to become Kazekage. The latter turned up their noses at his candidacy, and the especially brave dared to launch a preemptive strike. It is easy to guess that the peaceful residents will not be delighted with the fact that the head of the village will be the one who for several years in a row made everyone, young and old, tremble in fear. Returning from service on the southern borders, he could still hear the angry, spitting whisper behind him. There, the demon, coming to kill! After these words, Gaara felt that the sand surrounding him was not absolute protection but dirt, impenetrable blackness, stinking of the stench of victims who fell from its grains. And other people seemed to see all those liters of blood that the sand had absorbed during its existence. Sometimes it seemed that the grains of sand would not again shimmer beige in the carefree rays of the sun. He racked his brains for hours, trying to find an answer to the question of how to prove to people that he was no longer a weapon out of control. How to convince them that the days were over when he cared about nothing but the silence in his head, while the one-tailed demon was having fun. How to convey to people trembling with terror that he would become their protector. Gaara made the right decision for himself to first learn everything that had passed him by over the years. How could he become Kazekage if he did not know the value of the most ordinary things for people? Now he could see with his own eyes the beauty of the desert, the greenery of the trees, the freshness of the stream, which he had not noticed at all before. As if all this long time he had been deprived of both sight and touch. Now, feeling the breath of the wind on his skin, he felt its gentle warmth. And he cherished the simple things that surrounded the peaceful inhabitants and shinobi of his village, the clear sky, the radiant sun, the warmth of the air. And the simple things that gave the cherished moisture, the gloomy clouds, wet feet from the dew. And now it became important for him to listen to what his sister was chatting about. It was almost necessary to feel her caring embrace on his shoulders and see a smile that made dimples appear on her cheeks. What his older brother was silent about was also important to him. How he sometimes looked away during a conversation. Content with only a nod, Gaara wondered if the moment would come when Kankuro would approvingly pat him on the shoulder. Everything matters now. Everything matters to him, who wants to become the shield and hope of the hidden sand village. So what should he do? Continue to stand his ground or change his mind? Ruri rubbed her face sleepily and slowly rose up on her elbows, looking around. Gaara nodded in greeting, noticing her awakening. The girl shook her head in response, seeing that Ajisai was still asleep, and slowly stood up, but immediately grabbed her lower back. With a discreet hiss, she approached the entrance to the cave, looking somewhere into the distance. Her fussing woke up the bodyguard, who immediately found herself next to her mistress. "Ruri-san, how are you feeling?" The worried girl circled around her like a mother hen. "It's disgusting, to be honest." "How's your hand?" "Better," Adzisai said, clearly lying, smiling crookedly. Ruri turned towards the depths of the cave where their savior had been resting all this time. "Gaara-san, can you tell me if there is a stream nearby?" "The lake is a 10-minute walk to the east." "Great, Ajisai, I want to freshen up and I need to do something about my clothes." Ruri wrinkled her nose theatrically. "Although all our things were left somewhere in the forest. I'll find them, don't worry." "Gaara-san, will you come with us to the lake?" "Perhaps so." The girls walked ahead almost the entire way. The young lady kept grabbing Ajisai's healthy shoulder at the sight of flying midges with thin long legs or spiders crawling along the stems of plants. And it wasn't just dislike, she really shook every time she came face to face with another insect creature. "It seems that if they are unlucky enough to encounter a renegade from the Aburaim clan, then Ruri will simply fall down dead." Gaara chuckled in his thoughts. When the lake appeared on the horizon, Ruri detached herself from Ajisai's shoulder and rushed towards the clear surface of the water. She dipped her palms into the water with pleasure, scooping it up to wash herself. Gaara looked around and heard the quiet murmur of a spring near the stone gorges. Leaving the girls alone, he disappeared nearby, deciding to check his guess. Approaching the stream, Gaara took out an empty flask and scooped up some water. As he thought, it was fresh. Having collected water, Gaara slowly returned to the lake, but before the last green clump of wild plants he froze, not trying to take a step forward. Ruri was splashing around in the lake with a carefree smile, her dirty hanfu lying in a lump on the shore. Suddenly, the girl plunged into the water, leaving only a few air bubbles on the surface. She did not resurface for quite a long time, which made Gaara hesitate, thinking that something was wrong. He himself did not check the lake. But how would he do it, covered in sand armor? Anxiety continued to fan the bad thoughts in his head. Gaara was about to leave his hiding place, when suddenly a dark head appeared above the water. Ruri lashed out with her hand, causing a lot of splashes, and was trying to catch her breath after a long dive. The girl's long black hair floated on the surface of the water like a sheet, spreading like liquid silk. Could silk even be liquid? A confused thought, but Gaara could not find other words right now. For the first time, he felt his face burning, especially his cheeks. Touching them with his fingertips, he abruptly removed his hand, not understanding the cause of this affliction. A satisfied Ajisai appeared on the horizon, carrying the remaining things on her back. Ruri turned to her and began to leave the water. With each step the girl took, Gaara felt his own heartbeat grow louder in his temples. Long hair stuck to the snow-white skin of her back and created a striking contrast, ending somewhere at her waist, which resembled the narrow neck of an hourglass. "What am I doing?" Turning away, undoubtedly at the most interesting place, Gaara left the secluded place with the help of the body flickering technique, once again finding himself at the stream. Gaara suddenly felt the demon's loud howl in his head as he watched the rushing water. The one-tailed beast was raging, demanding that he crush the cause of the disturbance with his sand paws. This sometimes happened when he became too emotional. Gaara assumed the lotus position and listened to the murmur of the water and the rustling of the trees. He evened out his breathing and concentrated on the singing of the birds, noting that the demon's cries were gradually dying down. About half an hour passed before he returned to the lake. The girls had changed their clothes and looked much better than after spending the night in the cave. "I thought you had left us," Ruri babbled. Only now was he able to examine his fellow travelers more closely. The heiress of the Kirigaya clan was short and had beautiful, slender fingers, which she was now using to braid Ajisai's damp white hair into a tight braid. Her regular features and thin lips, stretched into a smile, made her look like the porcelain dolls Temari had played with as a child. The new dress politely hid the beauty of her figure, but in no way overshadowed her graceful movements. The sleeves rolled down to her elbows, revealing her slender wrists, which made Ruri truly look like a doll, not a living person. You definitely won't find people like that among the shinobi. Ajisai sat hunched over, leaning back a little so that her mistress could more easily fiddle with her hair. She had the lightness of a kunoichi, but at the same time her sinewy body was easily in an awkward position. She turned to Gaara, and he examined the fresh scar on her left eyebrow. It was already pink, which meant that she had not received it yesterday. When the hairdo was done, the girls stood up, unpacking their backpacks. Gaara noted that Ajisai was a head and a half taller than his mistress, as well as himself. I found a spring with fresh water, he said, pointing in the direction. Excellent. Ajisai threw off her backpack again, and after rummaging around, pulled out an empty bottle. Madam, give me your flask. Ruri quickly reached into a small backpack, pulling out a black liter flask with a leather-embossed handle. Ajisai ran towards where Gaara pointed. He himself approached her, watching his bodyguard go. Where are you going next? Ruri's voice suddenly sounded nearby, like a bolt from the blue. I'm on a mission. Let me guess you can't tell me the details? Ruri smiled, putting her index finger to her lips. True, and you? Will you continue to wander through the forest, afraid of every bug? Well, they're disgusting. Don't they scare you? Kurigaya objected with childish naivety. No. I'm a shinobi. Aren't shinobi afraid of anything? They're not afraid. Shinobi usually tolerate it. Are they tolerating it? They endure, Gaara repeated the axiom. Hunger, thirst, physical and mental pain. They endure injustice, anger, insults. They endure for the sake of family, for the sake of friends. They endure the death of their comrades. Realizing that he had said too much, Gaara adjusted his travel bag. Sorry, I got carried away. How sad it sounds. The corners of her mouth turned down. I wouldn't want to live like that. I agree. Ordinary life seems happier and simpler to me, Gaara said dreamily, and then, noticing Ruri's intent gaze, he stopped short. But I'm a shinobi and I can never be ordinary. By the way, have you considered asking for political asylum in some hidden village? I think the hidden leaf would suit you perfectly. Are you from this village? No. His protector was safely hidden in the depths of his travel bag. Actually, I have another goal. Is this a secret? No, I'm not a shinobi. Ruri laughed loudly. I'm looking for a priestess who lives in the land of snow. Gaara raised his eyebrows in surprise, causing confusion in the Kurigaya heiress. Yes, it may sound stupid, but I heard that she has a real gift of clairvoyance, and she is not a shinobi. I want her to teach me everything. Why do you need this? Since childhood I have often heard that because a person has a mole under his eye, his fate will be full of tears and sadness. I have 2 such moles and so far this damned prophecy works. Gaara looked at her face again and noticed that indeed, there were tiny moles on her cheekbones under each eye. Don't you decide your own destiny? Gaara asked. I don't know. Up until now I've lived the way my mentors and parents told me to. It all ended badly, as you know. For a moment she became more thoughtful. Now I want to control my own destiny, and having some kind of hint from above will make it much easier, knowing what lies ahead. And I have to do at least something for this. Aspiration is good, but are you sure you've chosen the right path? You said you wanted a normal life. What if my fate is already decided, and I refuse the only way to change it? Ruri interrupted with a counter-question. You're like my close friend from the Hidden Leaf, you won't know until you try, right? Kurigaya smiled again. Well, what about you? Do you have a dream, Gaara? My dream, he began thoughtfully. I guess I want to become the head of my hidden village. They're going through hard times there now. But I don't know if I'll succeed. My friend from the Hidden Leaf is convinced that he'll become Hokage someday, although he's a real eccentric. Gaara allowed himself a short smile, remembering Uzumaki Naruto. He's always chatting about how he'll admire his face when it's carved into a rock with the faces of the previous heads. He'll be the most successful and coolest Hokage that the Hidden Leaf has ever known, I think life is too short to make other people's dreams come true, Kurigaya said shrewdly. What exactly do you want? Gaara was silent for a minute, thinking about his answer. Should I continue to stand my ground or change my mind? I want to become the head of my village. And this is my dream. Chapter 3. I hope you can do it. Ruri smiled so familiarly and warmly that a chill ran down Gaara's spine. The image of his once beloved uncle loomed in his memory, and even the girl's face at that moment seemed very similar to him. You are a kind and strong shinobi, Gaara-san. Thank you. Her last words stabbed him in the heart, and Gaara's unexpectedly frowning face made the young mistress tense up. He felt his pulse quicken again from the rush of memories, spreading regret through every coil of his blood vessels. As his body was filled with yet another bitterness of remorse, Gaara remembered one of the conversations between his older sister and brother, which he had almost always ignored before. The dosage is very important. Kankuro prepared for the mission by filling the compartments of the combat dolls with poison. The dark liquid flowed through the tubes, irrigating the weapons hidden inside. There are poisons that kill immediately, and there are those that make the victim suffer for several hours, or even days. This gives a chance to remove the poison from the body and cure it. Temari noted correctly. The puppeteer, as usual, started talking after his sister's words about preparing for the mission. Seeing how her younger brother was changing the bottle, Temari chuckled and summed it up. Yes, you puppeteers, as always, are full of humanity. It's a different matter with my fan or Gaara's-san once, and that's it. It depends on how you look at it. Using the right dosage, you can kill, or even after the toxin is extracted, the victim will never recover, suffering from side effects for the rest of their life. Okay, I've convinced you. There's nothing human about you. As with all shinobi, Kankuro finished with a satisfied chuckle. Gaara realized that he would never be cured of this type of toxin. Sorry, did I say something wrong? Never mind. He turned away, trying to swim out of his memories. Ajisai approached, drawing Ruri's attention to herself. Gaara knew that the girl knew nothing about the shinobi world or his past deeds, and in her eyes he truly seemed like a good person. Ajisai, Ruri, I need to continue my mission. Gaara interrupted the girl's conversation. We understand. The bodyguard answered with all seriousness. I have some advice for you. Gaara looked at them and was amazed. Their eyes were blazing with student enthusiasm, as if he, the sensei, was about to lecture the genin. First, change your clothes. You are wearing very expensive fabrics. This gives away that you are wealthy people. If not the chief's people, then the fugitive ninjas may attack again. Second, Ajisai, tell me, do you know how to perform the transformation technique? Is this when I need to change places with an object? No, you're talking about the substitution technique. The essence of reincarnation is to change your appearance. Remember. Gaara alternately folded the seals of the dog, boar and ram and reincarnated into Ajisai, causing genuine surprise among the girls. Its long-term maintenance will help improve chakra control, but will also increase its consumption. Be careful. If you can spot the bandits in advance, reincarnate into any man. Psychologically, 2 girls are too easy prey. If your amount of chakra is enough, then create a reincarnation on Ruri as well. This is brilliant, Ajisai whispered barely audibly. You just don't have enough experience, Gaara stated. Third piece of advice, be sure to find yourself a sensei, then you'll be able to withstand a large number of enemies. You have an excellent natural element, you can both fight and defend with it. Thank you very much, Gaara-san. Ajisai bowed. Thank you, Gaara-san. Ruri looked away for a second, as if she was considering the need for her next words, but decided to add, be careful on the mission. You take care of yourself too. His image crumbled, and the grains of sand, caught by the wind, were carried away into the horizon. Using the body flickering technique, he returned to the point where he had aborted the mission after hearing the explosion. The pursuers had finally fallen behind. Gaara was able to skillfully hide his presence, and thanks to the transformation technique, confused those around him. For some time, no one would distract him from his intended path. After replenishing his food supply and buying a ticket for the ship, Gaara realized for the first time that he would see the real sea. The one that the people of his home village had never even dreamed of. The one that his older brother and sister had never seen. For some reason, he really wanted them to enjoy the sight too. His chest felt heavy. Compared to Shark Bay, the Sensu Sea was so vast that the setting sun seemed like a grain of sand. The waves quietly carried the ship into the distance. The scattering of stars in the sky began to sparkle. Gaara enjoyed the silence, cherishing the hope that the sea was lulling not only his rebellious soul, but also the equally rebellious demon. Surprisingly, the desert thunderstorm was silent, as if afraid to wet its sandy interior. Gaara watched the mesmerizing views from a secluded spot on the deck. Every now and then, a member of the crew passed by, discussing the message they had sent in low voices. From their conversations, Gaara realized that a storm was approaching from the north to the west, so the route would be changed. The detour would add half a day to the journey, but it would ensure the safety of the passengers. The wind was getting stronger. They were far from the storm's epicenter, but its echoes still hit unpleasantly with icy damp air. Gaara decided to return to the cabin. Within a few hours, someone curious also heard the conversations, and rumors quickly spread throughout the ship. The morning turned out to be hot for arguments. Someone was indignant, someone was afraid of the wrath of nature, and there were those who missed the hot topic of conversation and lay in the cabin, dreaming of setting foot on solid ground. Gaara thought as he looked out the small window at the sea, still calm during the day, beating its angry waves against the side of the ship. There were many majestic techniques in the world, shinobi who could tame some of the elements, but even the most powerful of them would not be able to withstand a natural disaster. And what about the peaceful people? Their fears and concerns already soaked every plank and steel of the ship, and their emotions felt like bitter marmalade. Shikako was still silent, and this surprised the medium. The demon's perception was sensitive to any negative emotions. The one-tailed one turned them into his entertainment. But now the silence was alarming. The land of snow was the most amazing place Gaara had ever seen. For a man who had spent his entire life among the sands and the scorching sun, visiting here was like entering another dimension. Frozen mountains covered in a thick layer of ice gave way to high snowdrifts that buried invisible obstacles beneath them. When the thin crust of ice crunched under his feet for the first time and Gaara felt himself falling into the soft snow, he immediately tried to grab onto something. For a moment, the heart of the seasoned shinobi, not expecting a trap, sank. When the sensation of free fall ended, Gaara found himself standing waist-deep in snow. Gaara looked around. There was no enemy on the horizon, or he was well hidden. Silence filled the snowy valley. The rare tops of tall trees swayed gently in the wind. Mighty trunks with thick, thinly striped bark and needles instead of leaves warned of the harsh nature of these places. If you lose your vigilance, you will die. His cheeks were tingling unpleasantly, but it didn't stop Gaara from concentrating. No sign of another shinobi's chakra or technique being used. Exhaling loudly, the tired Sandman began to break through the snowdrift. Gaara found himself thinking that the snowdrifts were very similar to quicksand, although they didn't drag. Another snowflake flew into his face and instantly melted. Gaara stopped, holding out his open palm. As if in a dance, cold grains swirled in the air, like the skirts of noble ladies at social events. One or two snowflakes landed on his palm and slowly melted on his frozen hand. The sharp edges of the crystals were erased, crumbling right before his eyes, until they disappeared completely. Looking at this miracle of nature, Gaara remembered one of the evenings of his distant childhood. Uncle Yashimaru spent another sleepless night with him. His golden hair shimmered copper in the dim light of the lamp. Gaara felt like he was about to fall asleep, but Yashimaru tried to lure him away so that the young medium wouldn't lose control of the one-tailed beast. "Gaara-sama, let me make you some strong cinnamon tea and tell you an interesting story?" Yashimaru suggested. "What? About the caravan and the gerbil again?" "No, I remembered the one I haven't told you yet." The uncle helped his nephew down from the high bed and took him by the hand, accompanying him to the kitchen. About a distant country full of snow, Uncle Yashimaru, What is snow? Snow is a weather phenomenon, the man explained. When water in the sky freezes and falls to the ground as snowflakes. Snowflakes? What do they look like? They look like little crystals, and they melt immediately if they get into a warm place. They went into the kitchen. Yashimara sat his nephew down at the table and started making tea. While the leaves were sipping, he looked into the attic and took out coffee beans and a Turk. For him, spending another night without sleep was a real test, but he had to hold out until the morning. Then the Kazakage promised to replace him personally. Do we ever have snow? When can I look at snowflakes? It never snows in our village. It's very hot here, Gaara-sama. Yashimara had a great idea. He opened the freezer door and scraped the frozen condensation with his fingers. But you know, even in our desert you can find a little snow. Yashimara leaned down to get closer to Gaara and extended his hand with the nearly melted snow towards him. Wow! Why is it getting smaller? Doesn't it hurt? No, Gaara-sama. Uncle smiled good-naturedly. See, the snow melted from the warmth of my hand and turned into water. Do you want to try it? Is it possible? Of course, I'll get some more now. Uncle immediately appeared at the refrigerator. Having scooped up a new portion, he quickly returned to his nephew. Gaara was not afraid and immediately touched the treasured snowflakes. From the warmth of his fingers, they quickly began to melt. The excitement in his nephew's eyes pleased Yashimara. Gaara noticeably perked up. Uncle, tell me the story now. The coffee was slowly brewing over low heat. Yashimara was finishing pouring tea for his nephew. There was only enough cinnamon left for a couple of drinks. This is a story about a snow wolf. The uncle began, placing the drink in front of his nephew. Weightless snowflakes were falling from the sky, sparkling in the moonlight like little diamonds. A little traveler was wandering through the forest, not losing hope of finding her way home. But all she could see were trees covered in snow. She raised her head to the sky and looked at the stars. Maybe they would help her? However, the twinkling of the stars did not give an answer. Gaara looked at his uncle, fascinated. Drink your tea, Gaara-sama, or it will get cold. Yashimara took the Turk off the fire, pouring the coveted coffee. After taking the first sip of the tart drink, he grimaced slightly and reached for a piece of sugar. After stirring and tasting again, the man smiled contentedly. His late sister had once teased him that real adults drank coffee without sugar or milk. Seeing his nephew's demanding gaze, Yashimara continued. She had been walking forward for a long time. She hadn't turned left or right, because her grandfather had once told her that was the fastest way to get lost. The coffee was too strong, which made her want water. Yashimara reached for the decanter. Life in the forest seemed to have stopped. No breath of wind, no voices of people or animals, only snow settling on the ground. The girl was overcome by fatigue, and she sat down by a tree. Her eyelids began to feel heavy, and she really wanted to sleep. Suddenly she felt hot steam on her face. Her uncle skillfully lowered his voice, increasing the atmosphere, and Gaara's mug was already half empty by that time. The girl raised her eyes and was amazed. A large she-wolf was standing in front of her. Her fur shone silver in the moonlight, and a dark stripe adorned her forehead. When the she-wolf realized that she had been noticed, her ears twitched playfully, and she asked the girl what such a small one was doing alone in the forest at night. Uncle! Uncle! Gaara closed his eyes. Just don't tell me she'll eat it. Yashimara laughed. It's a good story, Gaara-sama. Would you like some more tea? The man suggested, glancing at the empty mug. The nephew nodded. While Yashimara was pouring the drink, he continued his story, and the she-wolf was truly enormous, the size of a furaku. And strangely enough, this huge beast moved almost silently, smoothly, as if gliding. The girl was not afraid of the she-wolf, and replied that she did not want to disturb the keeper of the forest. And she admitted that she was lost and could not find her way home. The traveler frowned, looking as if she was about to cry. The she-wolf did not get angry at the human child and offered to help. The girl immediately stood up, shook off the snow, and the she-wolf led her forward. After some time, the houses of the cherished village appeared in the distance. The little girl was very happy. The she-wolf walked the traveler home. The girl was happy and began to thank her. The she-wolf bowed her head, and she stroked her giant muzzle. The keeper squinted blissfully, while the little girl scratched her under the chin. Suddenly she said that she would meet the girl before the next snowfall. And she jumped into the air, turning into billions of snowflakes, which were immediately picked up by the wind and carried away somewhere into dreams. Gaara pulled on a warm scarf, almost completely hiding his face. His eyes, accustomed to squinting, could no longer discern anything in the white stream. With each next step, his legs became heavier. The sand armor was wet and weighed down, like the weights he had seen on Rock Lee, and the gourds seemed to press harder than usual on his back and shoulders. But this snow madness had its end. Gaara lost track of time when the first islands of land appeared. The snow here lay in a light mound, sometimes exposing the black soil. The abrupt change in the landscape surprised the shinobi. Walking a little further, he saw the first green bushes growing closer to the rocky gorges. Not believing his eyes, Gaara decided to check the map. But the paper did not deceive him, he was on the right way to the residence. The spirit of spring seemed to be in the air. The snowdrops bared their unbloomed buds, as if embarrassed to show all their beauty. Warm air fought with cold, alternately replacing each other in a dancing stream. Gaara pulled off his scarf. The first to greet Gaara at the entrance to the city were two guards dressed in unusual uniforms. They did not resemble the standard shinobi vests, and did not have protective plates. Each of the guards had a strange mechanism attached to their right hand, occupying their entire forearm, and on their left shoulder was a crystal framed in metal, reminiscent of an epaulet. This is most likely the famous chakra armor invented by the scientists of this country. Gaara read about this technology in preparation for the mission, a special type of armor that allows the chakra to be drained from ninjutsu and genjutsu while enhancing the wearer's chakra. Not expecting guests, the young men perked up. A wave of alertness ran through their bodies, making their muscles tense. A second and they would be ready to respond to an attack. In appearance, they seemed much older than Gaara, but younger than Sensei Baki. "I'm on a mission from Hidden Sand," Gaara announced loudly. The wind barely stirred the long black bangs of the guy, who was glaring at Gaara with his blue eyes. The second one was slightly taller than Gaara himself, and impartially watched him approach. "Scroll!" the guard commanded in a bass voice, shaking his head to brush his bangs from his forehead. After carefully studying the instructions from the Hidden Sand, the one who seemed to have a calmer disposition sighed heavily and activated the mechanism on his right hand. Cables immediately appeared from it, the ends of which were attached to tree trunks and the pointed roofs of houses. He rushed towards the tallest building, Kazahin Castle. The second guard walked up to the booth at the entrance and gave the signal. A stream of unnaturally purple chakra shot into the sky. As soon as the replacement arrived, the guard's blue eyes glanced at the traveler's tired expression. He gave the signal with his palm and led Gaara through the city. "You'll stay here." Pointing to a small house, the young man thought for a moment. "Most likely, Mrs. Kazahana will receive you tomorrow morning. I or Arita will come for you." "What's your name?" "Gaara." "And I'm Koro." "Bye, kid." Having released the ropes, Koro took off and disappeared from sight. Entering his temporary shelter, Gaara was pleasantly surprised. A warm and clean room with a large stained glass window beckoned the tired traveler to catch his breath. A large bed with a soft mattress was eager to immerse him in the realm of bliss and serene sleep. Gaara only took off his warm clothes and carefully hung them on a small ridge. The bottom of his combat uniform was wet from constant contact with the snow. Having taken out a spare set and changed, Gaara sat on the bed, trying not to fall asleep. Every cell of his body ached from the hard road of a desert shinobi unaccustomed to such conditions. But no matter how tempting this minute of peace was, he had to endure it. And never fall asleep. "What a rare guest in our area!" Lady Kazahana caught up with Gaara. "Was the road hard for a sand ninja?" A slight smile touched her always scarlet lips. "Thank you for your concern, everything is fine. However, I was more surprised by the greenery near the residence than by the snow." Before, there was no sign of anything other than glaciers in this country. Just flying snowflakes and a cold, piercing wind. Many people said this about these places. In this place, your tears will freeze, and your heart will turn to stone. Mrs. Kazahana theatrically clenched her fist and moved her hand to her chest. Such an expressive manner did not surprise the daimyo. She remained a famous actress, especially in the land of fire. But times have changed. I hope that someday I will be able to turn the land of snow into the land of spring. Gaara didn't care much for her bravado, but he continued to listen intently. Koyuki Kazahana walked to the long table and grabbed a familiar scroll engraved with the land of wind. Tell me, do you know what this document is about? Kazahana continued, turning it over in her hand. Of course not. I'm not allowed to. The woman chuckled. My confidants laughed when they heard your daimyo's proposal. Gaara's face was momentarily surprised, and Lady Kazahana smirked contentedly. She didn't like it when the audience showed indifference. They said that if the boy had known what he was talking about, he would have burned it at the first opportunity. You are an ace at maintaining intrigue. My calling does not allow me to conduct a dialogue as straightforwardly as you shinobi. Koyuki settled herself on the chair, leisurely throwing her right leg over her left knee. The hems of her long dress revealed her high-heeled shoes. What do you know about our armor? Only that it sucks out chakra from ninjutsu and genjutsu, strengthening the host's chakra. That's how it used to be. Pride in her country's scientists was evident in her voice. Now these devices are equipped with a reflection of techniques, which are sent back at full force to the enemy. And with the use of an additional device called the Crystal of Silence, one can seal a great power, for example. She put her index finger to the edge of her lower lip, assuming a feigned thoughtful look. Eight-tailed demon? Opening the scroll again, she glanced at the contents. The Wind Country Daimyo requests that you make chakra armor for his personal army. And a Crystal of Silence. 2. Koyuki paused again, keeping her eyes on the sand shinobi. The audience was tense, just like before the climax of a movie with her participation. I am prepared to pay very well, judging by the advance payment offered. Do you understand what this means for the hidden sand village? Destroying the hidden village and seizing the military power in the form of a tailed demon. I have a guess. Have you had time to prepare an answer? Of course. She was again amused by the restrained, indifferent reaction. Do you want to know? Gaara was tired of being the mouse that the big, powerful cat played with. With a tired smirk on his bright red lips that so easily doomed his home village to ruin. I don't have the authority. I like your correctness. Well, you made me happy, so I'll tell you. As Gaara walked along the safe path near the border zone of the country of Earth, he again felt the approach of several shinobi. They were his longtime pursuers. Deciding not to complicate the situation, he stopped. Starting a fight on the border of another country was a bad idea. Especially when its shinobi were people from the Hidden Stone. The old feud from the Second Shinobi World War still gives its seeds of discord. Neither sand nor stone forgot their grievances. Until now, when they crossed paths on missions in other countries, they had endless squabbles. The landscape was not favorable either underfoot, the earth with a high granite content, behind his back, solid rocks and gorges. The first rare trees with barely noticeable creeping grass were far ahead. Gaara stopped, deciding to prepare in advance, crushing the rock, absorbing the necessary minerals, turning them into sand. It would take some time. The sand from the gourd, soaked in his chakra, would only be enough for quick attacks at short and medium range, if you remembered to protect yourself. For massive long-range techniques, it was no longer enough. The familiar seal of concentration began to irritate. Gaara had long ago noticed that he did not like to form seals, and so constantly used his hands in battle. He had long ago trained the sand to respond to gestures, a wave of the palms, a clenched fist, wiggling the fingers, but this only worked with frequently used techniques. Suddenly the wind died down. They were very close. Let's crush them. We'll crush you. I want to hear the crack of their bones. You will hear. Gaara felt the ground tremble. He immediately lost his footing. The ground, like a victim of an earthquake, cracked, forming an unnatural funnel for these places, cherishing to catch the prey that fell through. The sand from the gourd formed a solid platform and Gaara flew up, surveying the battlefield. Suddenly, spiraling gusts of wind formed from the left and right. The sand reacted, forming a semidome above its owner. The enemies were still hiding. Gaara landed and bent down, touching the ground with his palms. His sensor skills helpfully indicated the location of all the attackers hiding underground. In an instant, streams of sand hit those places, forcing the pursuers to show themselves. TCH. As expected of the desert demon. The first to speak was the hardened shinobi with 3 scars on his forehead, which also affected the left side of his face. His subordinates were spread out around him. The shinobi wore black uniforms without the insignia of the village. Who so stupidly picked you to kill me? Your techniques won't work on me. Oh, wait, demon, we can surprise you! The enemy grinned. Those at the front of the line formed seals, and the earthen boulders were directed towards Gaara. The speed of the techniques was high. The shinobi clenched their hands into fists, and the clods of earth took on a different shaped fetters for the hands and feet. The second pair of shinobi summoned Weasel Ninja, who began to run around the battlefield, creating a wind funnel resembling a barrier. As soon as the earthen bonds bound Gaara, they immediately began to thicken, squeezing his limbs. Suddenly, a very young shinobi, who was standing last, ran forward and took out a roll of sealing cloth from behind his back. The cloth flowed, revealing black writing. Are you a hidden sand shinobi? Gaara guessed, seeing the kanji of the fuinjutsu that his native village practiced. So what? The leader with scars on his face grinned. Just don't make a surprised face, as if none of our guys tried to kill you. The cloth rose above Gaara's head, enveloping him. The user of the technique formed seals, concentrating chakra to seal. Everyone froze. The center of the roll glowed for a moment, and a seal mark appeared on it. The attackers looked at each other, and their faces shone with glee. The brave men thought encouragingly of their modest squad being rewarded for capturing the main headache of their village. But the moment of triumph did not last long. Sand grains fell from the roll, gathering in a pile around it. Turn around! The squad leader commanded. Are you really? The young man perked up in surprise. Turn around, I said. The shinobi repeated. When the roll opened, there was only a crumbling sand clone in place of the desert demon. The attackers immediately turned around, hearing a rustling sound from behind a huge wave of sand was approaching them. The wind barrier collapsed, the summoned animals evaporated in a cloud of smoke. Gaara walked calmly across the surface, not sinking into his own sand field. The tops of his attackers' heads peeked out from under the massif, not expecting to get out alive. Come on, do it! I will do it! Have mercy, please. The youngest of them immediately babbled, not hiding the tears in his eyes. Who sent you? Don't say it, Tetsuya. The leader forbade. I promise to spare your life if you tell me who hired you. Kill him. Kill the traitor. I'll kill you. It was council member Mr. Numa Keoshi-sama. The boy blurted out. He's holding my mother hostage. I didn't mean to. I didn't mean to. Rag. Another shinobi growled. Okay. Gaara nodded contentedly. What's your name? I am Takeo. Takeo, I promise that your mother will be released soon. She will be fine. As I said before, I will spare your life. Crush him. Thank you? Thank you? The young shinobi whined. I do not intend to kill my own. Gaara announced to everyone. I will never again take the life of a compatriot. Your actions will be condemned by the Council of Elders, and you will receive the punishment that is due to you. Whether they decide to pardon you or not is up to them. Gaara left the attackers and headed towards the passage connecting the earth and wind countries. Another failure. The old man frowned sadly and began to stroke his sparse beard as usual. For him, this is a surefire way to calm down and not say too much with his hot temperament. This fourth puppy must be protected by a tailed demon. How many attempts have already been made, and all in vain? The hem of his white cloak fluttered as the man took his fill of looking at his badly beaten subordinates. Bruises, abrasions, and a broken arm on one of them convinced the old man that the battle with the youngest son of the previous Kazekage had not been easy. But they did not convince him not to punish the negligent performers. There have been so many attempts that I'm afraid I won't have enough fingers on my hands. The elder's shoulders shook. His hand immediately froze at the base of his chin. It seemed as if the walls of this room, lit by 3 thick wax candles, reflected the old man's quickened heartbeat with the hum of a bell. The man heard the familiar rustling of sand. Turning around, he saw the same puppy and 4 piles of sand next to him. Brag, did you crush the poor guys with your damned sand again? Didn't even leave any bones? The elder's lips trembled with excitement, and his tongue did not stop, as if speaking out loud his thoughts full of anger. I will never return to the path of revenge. Your people are alive, and they will be judged fairly, according to the laws of the Land of Wind and the Shinobi Code. Well, well! And this is what the famous Gaara, the desert demon, is telling me? Unprecedented mercy. I know that these people did not want to follow your orders. They were not so stupid as to bother me, so they almost immediately gave in and admitted that you blackmailed them by killing the people dear to them. Perhaps I have justified my nickname for cruelty, but I have never woven intrigues or played so dirty. Gaara ordered the sand to return to the gourd. Also, Elder Kaoshi-san, be careful if there is a sandstorm outside. As soon as the old man felt the trace of the Jinchuriki's chakra leave the house, he kicked the low chest of drawers on which one of the candles stood with a dashing movement. The stand shook, rushing to the floor. Ow! Kaoshi screamed in pain, rubbing his bruised leg. Hot wax spread across the wooden floor, and the candle wick tilted. The burnt smell hit his nose sharply, but the old man did not have time to put out the fire that had formed. The tongues of flame greedily bit the old dry floorboards, filling the room with crackling. The old man, frightened, ran to the door. Help! Fire! Kaoshi managed to shout before a sandstorm swept into the house. It was late evening. The anticipation of a quick meeting was pulsing in his temples. The light was still on in the windows of Temari's house. She was not sleeping. Gaara walked quietly. Although he did not try to hide his approach, the life of a shinobi left its mark on everyday habits. Temari always walked as if swaying, like a leaf swaying in the wind. Kankuro's steps were like a precisely calibrated line on a scroll. Gaara froze in front of the front door, slightly frowning, but still decided to knock. There was a commotion on the other side of the door. Gaara! The older sister exclaimed, smiling happily. Occasionally she allowed herself to let her emotions run wild, and in those moments she was like the brightest star in the sky. Her strong embrace weighed heavily on her tired shoulders, but she didn't want to get rid of them. Kankuro, Gaara is back! Temari screamed. They entered the hallway, and the light hit Gaara's eyes unpleasantly. Temari was hugging her little brother again. At the same time, the big hand of the older brother touched her shoulder. You've taken too long, Kankuro said. Temari was already off to a flying start. Shut up, she growled, not wanting to undermine her authority. I miss you. At this point, the elders suddenly pulled away from Gaara, not believing what they were hearing. It was as if their eyes had seen a ghost from their memories, and not their real younger brother. Temari pursed her lips, and Kankuro did not change his stunned expression. Temari was found first. We miss you too, Gaara. The 3 of them smiled stupidly at the same time. In ordinary families, sentimentality is normal, but for them, it had become something like a treasure. Let's go have some tea or something, Kankuro suggested, laughing awkwardly. That's a good idea, Gaara agreed, intending to tell him about the daimyo's plans and Lady Kazuhana's refusal.